All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular tricky, dangerous topics of your choice. Um, Tonight's one of those nights. Ian has asked for a review of the Candace Owens interview with Nick Fuentes. A link will be in the description, which hopefully will not be deleted by the provider. Because this is one of those interviews that will probably be deleted from most places it's posted. And specifically, Ian asked me to look at the latter half. I believe it's the hour and 25-minute mark forward, because there's a lot of personal drama in the first part, which I did not listen to. So other people can sort through that if they are interested. This is the race question. That's their primary disagreement. For those of you who are maybe new to this, who maybe know Candace but not Nick, or Nick but not Candace, or neither. Candace is someone who I will call a fairly generic but good conservative commentator, kind of like a Lauren Southern maybe in a way, but black. Has an, an interesting story on Macron's wife that she's sticking to. I mean, she seems to be genuinely curious and has everyone I know who listens to her regularly has good things to say about her. She seems like a very just a generic good commentator on politics and current events. Nick, for full disclosure, I don't listen to Candace Owens. Not because I don't like her or anything like that. She's just not on my Rolodex of go-to sources. And neither, for different reasons, is the subject of the interview, who is Nick Fuentes. For anyone who might be listening to this who doesn't know who Nick Fuentes is, Nick Fuentes is a character, to put it mildly. He is a very young. I believe he's in his like early 20s, maybe mid 20s. Very smart, very sharp kid. And he is a traditionalist, Catholic. Uh, at the risk of using an annoying word, I'm going to say fascist. Um, and I don't mean that as an insult. Um, it's just descriptively, I think the closest thing you can describe to his views, and not in a caricature kind of way. Because again, I he is a very smart kid, and this interview, um, I personally do not like Nick Fuentes. There's something about his face. There's something about his mannerisms that makes him come off as a profoundly unserious person. Um, I don't know what it is exactly. I don't like him. Um, but in this interview, he came off very well. Um, he didn't say anything wrong. I don't think there were a few comments that were accusing him very jokingly, very jovially even, of rage baiting Candace. I don't think he did, except for once. He called himself a racist, and that was a little bit of rage bait, because he's not, by his own self description, he is not in this interview. Your experience of him elsewhere might be different, but in this interview, his self description is not what most people would describe as a racist. Most people, when they talk about racism, if you grew up in the 90s like I did, racism is an unfounded animosity or dislike of an individual based on their race, right? It's the Shrek, like they judged me before they got to know me kind of thing. which racists in their own circle call, that's just heuristics, man. We'll get into that. It is worth mentioning, and Nick Fuentes, to his credit, kind of corrected himself when Candace pressed him on this. She's like, you describe yourself as a racist. Do you not mean racialist? And Nick Fuentes says, well, I used to call myself a racialist because I believe that races are real, but because that just gets called racist, he basically says, I just skip past all that. I'm a post-racist, meaning I don't care about the term. So he says, he seemed to speak as if it just saves time and is funny to call himself a racist, which admittedly is true. It does get to the point faster than calling yourself a racialist and then putting yourself on the defensive, which is unpleasant. It is more fun to be on the offensive by just calling yourself a racist to begin with. But that's only fun if you're dealing with an adversarial person. And Candace, for all of her failures in this interview, which we will get into, was not exactly adversarial. So I think in this case, it would have been more appropriate to give the sincere answer and say, no, racialist versus racist, whatever you want to say on that point. It is worth mentioning, and this is not the only time I will bring up Vox Day in relation to this interview, because he becomes relevant later. But the original term racist, the origin of the word is fascinating. And I learned this from Vox Day in his and Red Eagle's book, Cuckservative. I used to think the origin of the term came from Vladimir Lenin. Not true. The term racist came from an American Civil War general and Amerindian War general named Pratt. Pratt his most famous line is "Kill the Indian, save the man," meaning the man buried underneath the Indian. And his view was that the Indians were racist because they preferred their own culture and way of life to what the dialectic of history and the progress of civilization had in store for them. Because Manifest Destiny was basically just right-wing Hegelianism in America, as far as I can tell. A philosophical digression we don't need to get into now. But the thing about that, if someone prefers their own culture and way of life to someone's notion of what the march of progress and what civilization ought to look like, then they are a racist. Now, when you think about it, even the modern concept of racism, which I described a little while ago, is not that far off from the original meaning. And if you think about it, if you really think about it and spend like a day or two seriously thinking about the implications of all these ideas and stuff, they come even closer together. So biting the bullet, Nick Fuentes biting the bullet and just calling himself a racist is not actually an indefensible position, which is going to be very uncomfortable for a lot of people. The origins of these words matters. I'm not encouraging that, by the way. I don't think racism is a great frame to view the world through. But we're here to talk about race, so let's get into it. The subjects that they bring up here, they talk about. Let's get right into the hard stuff. Race and IQ. Candace Owens very amusingly brings up, and then hopefully I'll transition from talking about race. Sorry to interrupt myself. To talk about what happened to Candace. I want to spend some time talking about that, and not just rehash very very dangerous arguments by myself here. So, the race and IQ conversation that they had was very interesting. Now, I don't entirely agree with Nick Fuentes, but on his points, he was just factually correct about everything. And Candace Owens did something very strange. She summoned to her aid the spirit of Thomas Sowell in Intellectuals and Race, and basically said Thomas Sowell made an argument for blank slateism, essentially, that differences in group collective IQ were the consequence of culture and the consequence of externalities, let's say. Like, she gave... we'll get into the Israeli-Palestine analogy in a moment. But I had to look it up very quickly, and I mean, without reading the book, I think I did read Intellectuals and Race like 15 years ago. It's been a minute. And Sowell's writing is excellent, but that's not the sort of argument I'm used to hearing Sowell say. So I looked up the summary of the book, and according to the summaries, and again, I'm not reading the book in front of me or anything, but Sowell's primary criticism in Intellectuals and Race is that so much of the data has been suppressed by intellectuals in favor of ideological theories in regarding to race. Again, I don't have the book in front of me. I'm not referencing whatever argument Candace is making in particular, but the spirit of the book that she's referencing is siding with Nick Fuentes, not her, in terms of going to the data, in terms of going to the facts. And if you listen to any of Thomas Sowell's interviews, indeed, if you read literally any of his books, they're all the same book. All of Sowell's books are, let's put ideology aside and look at the data. Let's put ideology aside and look at the data. Now, some anti-libertarians might chuckle at that because Sowell is, of course, a Chicago school economist. He's got a little bit of an ideology himself, but he's still very good on the whole. And his points are correct, that we can't be hiding from the actual data on this. And to his credit, Nick Fuentes is very candid about this. He says, look, I'm not happy about this. I'm not excited that people are born the way they're born and that these numbers exist, but we're not helping anybody by pretending them away. And the reality, and this has been known by anybody who looks into it seriously and honestly for more than 15 minutes, there are group differences in average IQ in racial categories. Now, it's complicated because there's a lot of different factors that go into it, and you can commit a kind of categorical fallacy if you say, well, what's the average IQ of whites? Or what's the average IQ of blacks? And you're like, well, dig into that a little bit, and you find out that, Africa is the most genetically diverse continent on the planet. Like, there's more genetic diversity in the human populations of Africa than there is in all the other continents of the world combined, supposedly. I'm going on stuff I've read here. There's like a fallacy lurking here in grouping a bunch of unlike groups together as one group. And by the way, leftists are right when they say whites don't have a culture. Now they're phrasing it in a very, very antagonistic way. But the steel man of what they're saying is white is not a group. English culture is not the same as Italian culture. English have English culture, that's real. Italians have Italian culture, that's real. Russian culture is Russian culture, that's real. There are many white cultures, and there are some similarities between them, but to call that white culture is a kind of conflation and a category error. I mean, if you were to talk about black culture, and we're not just talking about the United States, but we're talking about all of Africa, that's not a thing. Asian culture, are we including Mongolians and their freaking like relaxed pastoral society with like Chinese rice paddy culture? Like, there are some similarities there, but there are also some pretty fantastic differences. Do you group Pakistanis in with Asia? How about Iranians? Are Iranians more white or are they more Asian? Ugh, I don't know. I'll let other people who care more sort out who falls into what exactly. And I don't mean to dismiss the broad categories either, by the way. If you ask a physical anthropologist, like, are there races? Yes, you can see it in the bone structure. Nothing your sociology professor has to say about, oh, there's no such thing as race because the differences within groups are larger than the differences between groups. That's nonsense. That's a dumb mathematical argument. That is, I'll let you look that up in your own time. I went through those courses. They're stupid. They are what Thomas Sowell was warning us against as far as advancing ideological theories rather than following the facts and following the data wherever it may lead. And the reality is that contra Candace Owens, IQ is not determined by culture. Now, you can have cultural effects that bring people down in the same way that, like, you might be genetically predisposed to be, 5'6" if you're Sicilian, or 6'6" if you're Dutch. But if you're like malnourished, you might not rise to the level of your genetic potential. But that potential is still there, and no amount of just bringing people out of, starvation or, dire circumstances and intergenerational stress or whatever will raise that ceiling, that cap. It just is what it is. You can't just feed a, short Sicilian man until he's as tall as a Dutchman. It just doesn't work that way. So, and one of the examples she brings up that I thought was worth, Candace Owens brings up on this point that I think is worth dwelling on for a second, is the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and how, Palestinians are being bombed and they're living in this situation where they're facing real malnutrition, and like that is going to have a bad effect on the development of their children, which sucks. It's awful. And it's like, well, how can you compare Palestinian IQ to Israeli IQ under these circumstances and think you have something objective? And there is a degree of validity to that. On the other hand, one of the expressions of intelligence is winning the wars you fight, or not perpetually getting into wars that you can't win. So like the fact that Palestine keeps ending up in bad wars with Israel is not like a high expression of like IQ. Compare that to like, Nick Fuentes brought up when he was asked like what's probably the highest IQ group. He says probably the Chinese or the Japanese. The Chinese have been in just recently, and if you look back in the history of China, like medieval China, if you go to the list of the 10 bloodiest battles in world history, like 7 of them are all in China. The history of China is the history of massacre to a degree that the European mind has a hard time comprehending. It was tremendously bloody. And so they are, with the size of the country they have now, they're facing conflict zones with India, with Taiwan, with Russia's kind of complicated. They're facing multiple conflict zones, and they've been holding back. They have not been getting involved in Taiwan, which they could have invaded like whenever they wanted. But there's a degree of restraint in China that is kind of indicative of what you'd expect of a higher IQ general population. Now, it is very important to point out that these features of racial categories don't describe individuals, which is again why I don't like racism as a frame. There are always exceptions. In fact, most individuals will be exceptions. That's what it kind of means to be an individual. They're like, there's a family resemblance model, but there's always variation. What these racial categories describe as the large group. And a really good example of this is what we call the MAOA, or the warrior gene. This is a gene, and I'm going on vague recollection of this. You can look this up if you'd like. It codes for processing an enzyme that deals with serotonin or something like that. But basically, the short of it is there's 5 variants of the MAOA gene. There's 3 that are pretty neutral and normal. There is 1 variant that makes people mildly antisocial. And there's 1 variant that makes people extremely antisocial. The 5th variant of the MAOA gene happens to have different distributions among different races. It is extremely low, to the point of almost non-existence, among Jews and among Asians. It's like 0.00. It's very, very small. It is higher among whites than among Jews or Asians. It is, and by higher we're talking like 0.2%. We're still talking very small numbers. It is higher among Hispanic, Latino, which modern demographers call white for some reason. I have no idea why. But it's higher in that population, in Hispanics, than it is among whites. We're talking like, 0.5%, something like that. And among sub-Saharan Africans, we're looking at about 4%. Right? Now, if you were to look at an individual, like just a single person from within a population, the odds of you landing on one of that 4%, very, very small. So most of the like sub-Saharan African men that you meet are not going to be in this category, which is again why like judging individuals based on the group is probably not wise. However, if you wanted to predict how large groups will behave, knowing these kinds of things matters, because a very small minority can have a vastly oversized effect. If you want to understand what I mean by that, if you go to the like most violent prisons, like the violent felon prisons, 80% of these people, regardless of race, whites, Hispanics, blacks, Asians, to whatever degree they're there, like 80% of them have this 5th variant. Most violent felons have this 5th variant of the MAOA gene. So if you have a population that has a higher percentage of that, what will the effect be? It is what it is. So, and that explains a lot. And by the way, we have a fairly good theory as to why the white population is low. And for the reasons I described with Chinese history, it applies to them as well. For the better part of the Middle Ages, the North Atlantic peoples, so like the Germans, English, Dutch, these kinds of peoples, had a system whereby they would capture, try and execute the most violent people in their society. If they got caught doing something, if they killed someone, if they raped someone, they would be executed. They would be removed from the gene pool. That has a cumulative effect over many, many years. People wonder why whites have tend to have, or seem to have, this is kind of speculative on my part, but is it just me, or does it seem like whites have, you know what I mean, European people seem to have autoimmune issues at a higher level than blacks or Asians. Could be Black Death. Could be everyone who didn't have an extremely strong immune system got wiped out. Black Death killed half of Europe. That's a selective pressure. If you look at West Africans who have sickle cell syndrome and sickle cell anemia in some cases, that is a byproduct of an adaptation that allowed them to be immune from malaria. It's a pretty big advantage when you're around malaria-carrying mosquitoes. So the people who imagine that race is only skin deep, it's the dumbest bumper sticker thinking imaginable. Or that, yes, maybe race will affect, or your genetics will affect height or skin or, things like that. But it doesn't affect you from the neck up. It doesn't affect your brain. Or the slightly higher tier version of that argument is like, maybe it affects your natural inclinations, but your brain is so plastic, your brain is so malleable that you can, those are very easily overcomable. Steven Pinker, in his book The Blank Slate, I think pretty definitively destroyed that view, that neuroplasticity as this complete answer to all things pertaining to genetic predisposition. And IQ is as Jordan Peterson put it, there is nothing more scientifically valid in the realm of psychology than IQ. In other words, if IQ is not valid, nothing else in psychology is. Which might also be true. I kid slightly. So it just, as Nick Fuentes says, it kind of is what it is. And by the way, that doesn't make anyone better or worse as a person. The life and being excellent and having a good life is not all about just being high IQ. It's actually not even all about being a rule follower. I was at an event with some people who had some edgy opinions, and I was talking to some of them, so many of the white nationalist crowd, for example, pride themselves in the sort of civil nature of whites as a group compared to these other groups. It's well, that doesn't appear to be working really well for the Brits right now, or the Nordic peoples. All this rule following, this they're so civilized. They're so people will occasionally post the Rudyard Kipling poem "When the Saxon Began to Hate." I think that Saxon might have gotten bred out of the English population. I don't think there's a Saxon waiting to wake up and hate in the English population as it is currently. Maybe they'll prove me wrong, but there's trade-offs to all these things. All else being equal, having a high IQ is better than not having a high IQ. But it is worth remembering that there is an inverse relationship between your IQ and the number of sexual partners you have. Now, people who are in the sort of right-wing edge crowd will be like, yes, because it's very civilized to not have, lots of promiscuous sex or whatever. but there's nothing they want more than like a little bit. Many of them are virgins. I don't mean that to like disparage the movement on that point. You know, but it is a correlation that like many of them, I think, would happily trade 10 to 15 IQ points for a couple of female experiences, you know. So, you know, these things are trade-offs. Where the conversation, to bring it back from my opinions to the Nick Fuentes Candace Owens interview, things got really interesting when Candace Owens brought up Jews and Jewish IQ. Said, you know, aren't Jews the highest IQ people? In response to Nick Fuentes saying it was probably Chinese or Japanese. And he said, well, Jews are pretty smart, but it's complicated, and they're I don't think they're the highest. And that led to Candace Owens asking, how do you go about choosing your data? How do you pick and choose? Which was a funny question because it sounds like kind of a gotcha, like, oh, you're taking data on this, but you're distrusting data on that. And the answer, how do you pick and choose, is you look at the quality of the data. I mentioned I'd bring up Vox Day again. Vox Day addresses this at some length in his on his blog. The myth of the like massive Jewish IQ. There's a couple places that cite average Ashkenazi Jewish IQ at 126. For anyone who knows like what these IQ ranges look like, that should be absurd on its face, and it is. And the reason that they came up with that number is IQ studies were done back in like the 60s or 70s or something. And they pulled Jewish students at a high-tier private school where they had basically self-selected the children of some of the smartest people in the Jewish community. And within that specific private school, Ashkenazi Jewish students scored on average of 126. Now, according to Vox Day, a similar study was done at like a Protestant, waspish, you know, Anglo school, and they came back with like an average of 128 or something. So the moral of the story is, if your selection, if your data comes from a high IQ population that had been selected by class, you're going to get really high average IQ, whether that's Jews or Asians or blacks or whomever. If you found a private black school that was attended by nothing but the children of black doctors and lawyers, guess what? They're going to have an average IQ of like 120 to 125 too. It's just that's how that selection works. And there are, I mean, Thomas Sowell's kids probably have like in that range, if not higher. Anyways, so Nick Fuentes is correct. Again, Jews as a group, and again, you have to separate the Ashkenazi from the other one, the Sephardics, and there's like a third one that I don't remember and no one cares about. But the Ashkenazi have, you can break IQ down into two categories. There's verbal and there's spatial. And whites and Asians are pretty balanced out there as far as spatial verbal. I think, yeah, generally. Ashkenazi tend, again, we're talking large populations, we're talking large groups. All you have to do, find an Ashkenazi Jew that's an engineer. He's going to have a high spatial IQ. Just, you know, race is not the best predictor of these things. Job more often is. But like as a group, they do skew much more verbal, much more linguistic. That's what the data suggests. And they are high. I think we're looking at among Ashkenazi Jews like 97, 98, somewhere in that territory. Whites average to like American, English, German whites average around 100. Americans are a little bit lower. I think we're like 90. We might be below Jews actually. I don't recall exactly. Germans and the Nordics are a little bit higher than Americans, and Chinese are around 103 on average, maybe 104, somewhere in that territory. And again, these are group numbers. They don't mean anything for individuals. There are, you can look at sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the countries have an average IQ of in the 70s, 80s in a few cases, lower in others. In any of those countries, you can go around and you will find guys with 130, 140, 150 IQ. They're around. We're talking about large groups, and the effect that the general population has on the society that these individuals have to live in. So, to return to the question, like that Candace asked, how do you pick and choose? The answer is you look at the quality of the data. Where did it come from? Where did it? Like what were the parameters? What were the standards that they set for their selection? How they go about collecting it? Are there obvious conflicts of interest or ideological conflicts by the researchers? You can just look at the data and choose based on the quality of the data. But it's so fascinating that is a kind of tantalizing question today, because I think many people are becoming disillusioned with old narratives. And so the temptation is to throw out data entirely, to throw out all numbers and statistics. Oh, it's all nonsense. Well, you're coming through, you're learning some things, you're becoming disillusioned. I get the temptation, but just because one argument is bad doesn't mean all arguments are bad. And the point, if it's take it or leave it with all data, arguments, whatever, in either case you have nothing. Because if you accept all the arguments, they contradict each other. And if you reject all the arguments, you have nothing at all. You have no reason to do anything, because these all come at the foundation of it all are what is good in the world, and those are built on arguments, or at least at the very least instincts that we have to trust or choose to take seriously or not. But Candace goes a little bit further, and she says, he who controls the textbook is king. And she poses this challenge of like all this data being presented, by whether it's IQ research or certain theologians or whatever, there are ulterior motives there. And it is a serious point. And I would offer as an answer to that challenge of like, how do you get to the truth or get to something like reliable facts when the presentation of all of them comes through bias and ulterior motives? You cannot find a textbook that does not have bias, or at least you wouldn't know if it does. And here I'm going to bring up one of my favorite Jews. That is Curtis Yarvin. If you haven't read his Fascicle 1, which he published earlier this year, or last year, I'm sorry, Jack Donovan and I reviewed it over on the Order of Fire YouTube channel. I would highly recommend you check it out. It's a great book, and Curtis Yarvin is a fantastic writer. He offers something like an answer to this, which is historical triangulation. You basically have to read lots of things from lots of different sources, and when you look back, the biases of other people's time periods are obvious to us, but our own biases are not obvious to us. But our biases would be obvious to people in the past. So if you can look back into the past and immerse yourself in the world of the past to the point that you can empathize with and mentally connect with people from the past, then you can look forward again through the eyes and from the mind of the past and get not a perfect, but at least a better perspective of what our own biases are. And it's not as if those past periods didn't have their biases, they do. But if you look at multiple periods of history, you can begin to see what's true in every society as opposed to what's only true in this society but not true in that society. And this was, by the way, it's a great method of studying concepts in general. It's one of the reasons I've enjoyed, not to plug him too much, but he puts out great stuff, Jack Donovan's The Way of Men, set within the context of a serious academic discussion about what is masculinity. There are competing notions in different societies. Different societies have different standards for what makes a man, what makes him good at being a man. And so there appears to be contradictions that lead feminist scholars to say, well, there is not one masculinity, but many masculinities. To which Donovan was like, well, there's some truth to that, but if you look down to the core, there are certain things that are always true in all societies as it pertains to men, and that's strength, courage, mastery, and honor. You can read the book if you like. There's actually a whole list of human universals that describe basically all civilizations. Religion is one of them, and sexual dimorphism in gender expression is another one. So, sorry, queer crowd on that front. So, anyways, so I think that's a worthwhile digression to answer Candace Owens' question there about how do you decide this stuff. You look at the data and you judge it, and you do the best you can. There isn't an objective method for doing this, but that doesn't mean everyone's methods are just as good or equally good, just as not everyone's arguments are equally good. So I'm going to skip the stuff Candace sort of grills him on personal stuff at the end, because I thought that was cheap and low and kind of a likely subconscious attempt to delegitimize Nick Fuentes, who, by the way, again, I don't like Nick Fuentes. And Candace seems like she would be a likable person, but something happened to Candace Owens. Everyone I've heard says she's very reasonable, she's very measured, she does good research, she asks good questions. In this interview, she did not. In this interview, she performed very poorly. Some people in the comments compared it to the the attempted Channel 4 interview with Jordan Peterson, all these attempted gotchas that just completely backfired. And it wasn't quite that bad, but it was bad. Nick Fuentes did very well, and he was just factually right about basically everything. And Candace was just wrong. She kept strawmanning. She kept misunderstanding. She kept she kept trying to do these failed gotchas. Like at one point she tried to. Nick Fuentes very casually said, "Oh yeah, like church scholars have and theologians have said negative things about interracial marriage, even if it's not a sin." And she's like, "Really?" And then she did an insert fact check, and she found a Thomas Aquinas quote where Thomas Aquinas said that people should not be married to others who are far removed in customs and manners from you. She's like, "Well, I don't see anything about race in there." It's like, well, okay, it's not about race, but if you don't see how it would apply to race, then you're not being serious. You're not being charitable in your interpretation, in your attempt to understand things. And I think Candace, who is probably, and again, I don't listen to Candace, I haven't heard her a lot before, is probably a very serious, thoughtful, and interesting person. And I say that because she was willing to talk to Nick Fuentes in the first place, which most people would not do. So much credit to her for that. But she fell into a kind of psychological trap, I think. This is what it looks like happened. She wanted to disagree with Nick Fuentes so vehemently that her curiosity and openness shut down. And she started grasping for anything she could find to attempt to distance herself from Nick intellectually and socially, by disagreeing with him as hard as she could. Basically, just finding everything that she could find to disagree with. And, I mean, that is a practical thing to do if you are a public figure in a media space where you can't afford to look like you are too friendly with someone who self-describes as a racist, right? So, from a professional perspective, fair enough. But if you want to rise above that, suppose you wanted to actually destroy Nick Fuentes' position. How would you do that? My view is you have to begin with charity. You have to begin with openness and genuine curiosity. You have to genuinely try to understand the other person's perspective. Not and the tell that they're not trying to do that is anytime someone says, "I'm genuinely curious," why? That's, they're not genuinely curious. But if you start asking questions like, "Oh, if that's true, then this would also be true," and you're not trying to hunt for contradictions, but you're trying to fill in the gaps to show your understanding. That's a good sign of having a charitable disposition, an open disposition, a curious disposition. Because it's only when you understand a position well enough that you can steelman it, that you can set it up on its best legs. That's the only time you can actually tear it down. That's the only time you can actually destroy it. You can't actually destroy an idea by straw manning it. Certainly not in a long form interview like this. Maybe if she was doing a CNN style 4-minute back and forth, yeah, you can steel man someone and then kick them off the show before they get a chance to respond in any kind of depth. But in a long form interview like this, these against an intelligent person like Nick, strawmans and misunderstandings will get exposed, and it will delegitimize you instead of the other person. So, if Candace, I think, had really wanted to push back against the racism stuff, there was an avenue there. And it's not my job to litigate this because I'm not a Christian, but I would have pushed on the relationship between race and Catholicism there. Because and Nick seemed, to his credit, to be very open about this. It seemed to be kind of a tender spot for him. And I'm sure he has his theological, background on this. I'm sure he's done his homework, so Candace couldn't just stroll in and beat someone as prepared as Nick. But that's what it takes. You have to listen. And if she had been listening, better, I think she would have known where to push harder and where not to push, especially if she wants to invoke the spirit of Thomas Sowell and his data-oriented perspective. So, for anyone who's listening to this, who's made it this far, first of all, thank you for not throwing me under the bus immediately. But if you want to disagree with racism, which I encourage you to do, you're at a bit of a disadvantage. And the disadvantage is this. The racists of the world, and not just the white nationalists and the Nazis, but there's a lot more of them than that, have been developing their arguments for many years, many decades. The left, and even the center-right, has so avoided the subject that there hasn't been a development of counter-arguments parallel to it. So there's a lot of catch-up that people who want to disagree with racism have to do, because the arguments for racism are out there, and I don't agree with them, but they're strong. There are good arguments for racism out there, and if you are going to disagree with them and be intellectually serious, you can always just choose to jump on a social bandwagon, forego intellectual seriousness, and just go with the consensus. That's a thing people can do. But if you are interested in philosophy, if you're interested in the truth, or at least clarity, what explains things best, there's some catch up to do. There's lots of bad arguments for racism. There are some good arguments. Most of the arguments being presented against racism are bad. That does not mean there are not good arguments against racism. But I think what we saw here between Candace and Nick was a demonstration of the difference between arguments that have been developed for a very long time. I'm speaking of Nick. Nick is young, but he's familiar with a lot of... He's doubtless familiar with Pat Buchanan, with James Taylor. Some of the things he's taken come from James Taylor, and I'm quite sure he's familiar with, Kevin McDonald and people like that. So Candace Owens is new to this space. She's been a conservative pundit for 2-3 years. Even in the interview, she said, "I'm just discovering all these things about history and stuff." There's some catch up to do. Nothing wrong with that. But if you are in a position of playing intellectual catch up, maybe don't come on too strong. You'll make your own side look worse, which is actually worse than just being silent. It is for those of you who are interested in learning more about this, but don't want to associate with people who you think are wrong intellectually, maybe wrong morally, and maybe pariahs socially, but you don't want to be a bad intellectual either. It is perfectly valid to listen to an argument and to say, "That's really interesting. I don't agree with that, but I don't have a good reason. Let me think about that." You don't need to provide a reason why you disagree. You don't need to let anybody browbeat you into being a racist or being an anti-Semite or believing this or believing that or being a Christian or being an atheist. You don't need to let anyone browbeat you into anything. You can just let the argument wash over you with openness, listen to it, and just chew on it for a few days or a few years. No one is obliging you to make a choice. But if you want to be serious, it is better to say nothing or that. That's interesting. I don't agree with that, but I'll have to think about it more. Than it is to give this kind of spaghetti test of misunderstandings and bad arguments that Candace Owens threw out. So I hope this was stimulating to people. I would say I hope I don't get myself into too much trouble, but I chose a blue-collar job, so I get to say whatever I want. You can't fire me. But really, I do think this conversation is going to blow up. At the risk of 3 references in one. My friend Jack Donovan wrote an excellent essay called "The Free Speech Fire Hose" earlier this year. And basically, the decensorship of X and of many of these other social media platforms has reopened up a lot of ideas that people have been protected from. And I guess the best frame of thinking about this is we don't have the immune system for it. We haven't been exposed to it, so now we're vulnerable to all kinds of arguments that we had not... we had not developed counter arguments to. So now you're seeing, and I think my favorite example of this in a kind of petri dish expression of what we're talking about are the flat earth arguments. Flat earth arguments are like the ultimate expression of this, because this is a very insular, small group of the internet that has, as hard as they can, developed their arguments. And when these people present their flat earth arguments to people who have never heard them before, oftentimes they get kind of blown away. Oftentimes they get persuaded. And it takes either someone who is very quick on their feet and has some general knowledge about things, or who has taken the time to study the flat earth arguments and say, okay, this is why the NASA photos are irrelevant. This is why the plane flight path thing is not what you think it is. This is why the lake photography test, you have to know the arguments. And this is why, in my opinion, theology debates are so interesting and so fun, is because these are arguments that have been developed for 2,300 years. Some of the theological arguments actually predate Christianity, fascinatingly. So you get some really, really high level, very developed arguments. And it's like playing chess where you're playing, I won't get all technical with chess openings, but like a very well developed chess opening versus having a flat earth debate. That's like playing chess 960 where all the pieces are mixed up and you're like, oh, I don't know what to do. This is all new stuff. So I think people are going to be facing a lot of that. Not just with race and the Jewish question, and and flat earth and all kinds of other subjects that they were protected from and they don't have the immune system for. It is a case, I would say, for beginning to study logic and rhetoric and philosophy in general, to help kind of bolster your immune system, sort of like a vitamin C shot daily. So anyways, thanks so much for listening. I went a little bit longer than I intended, but I hope this is valuable and certainly interesting. And thanks for listening. Take care.